Hi, James. It's Kim, and I do have a question. So, how do you design a cohesive dungeon? I feel like random rolls don't really hit it, and they can be all over the place. And sometimes I have a hard time with even if I know what the purpose is, setting up a dungeon, the rooms in an order that seems purposeful and not random. Thanks.
Thanks for the question, Kim. I can't wait to delve into it. Sorry, not sorry. Hey, I'm James. Towards the beginning of my game design career, I was also a paid beer reviewer. This meant I could write off both beer and games on my taxes. And let me tell you, it's hard knowing that I've already peaked. But I'm here today to dork out about dungeons and design on Crumbling Keeps, the Dungeon Dork. First off, if anyone ever sees Kim in person, give her a big hug from me. She's great, and she's been supporting Crumbling Keep for a long while now. One thing I have to mention is that I know Kim is also a solo player at times, so I'm going to try to address this question from multiple angles. First, let's talk about designing dungeons for a group. It helps to organize it and for inspiration if your dungeon has a theme. It helps more if it has several. There's a semi-easy method to do this, and I have to admit, this isn't original, but I can't remember when or where I read it. If anyone can pin this down, please let me know. I am very happy to give credit where credit is due, but it's been a while. In any case, think about your dungeon in three phases. How or why was the dungeon formed? What did it become after that? And what is it now? You can add more layers than this, but this will give the dungeon some definite direction. And three is a really great starting point and will satisfy most dungeons. Did it start as a sprawling underground complex created by a mad king to bury the dead? Did a necromancer move in afterwards to experiment on the corpses and do other weird wizard shit? As we know, wizards are always doing weird wizard shit. Does a horde of bugbear bandits live there now? And are they at war with the trolls on the lower level? So we have three layers of history on this dungeon now. What it was created for, what it was, and what it is. So in a sense, you get to build three dungeons in one. Now, if you're just mapping it out and deciding the general structure of it, you can stick with, okay, what did the Mad King do? What do these catacombs look like? And then from there, how did the Necromancer change it? Did the Necromancer add more chambers? What portions of it did the Necromancer take over for themselves? They may not have taken the whole dungeon. They may have to wander through catacombs before getting to the Necromancer's lair, which has long since been abandoned. Or has it? But now bugbears live there, and we know there's trolls on the lower level. So we can seed this dungeon now with what we know from this, with, well, of course, bugbears and trolls, but also weird necromantic magical stuff, undead, and things from an ancient empire that has long since crumbled to dust. I do want to digress here for just a moment, and I know I've talked about this on previous episodes, but it still does fascinate me that the idea of the dungeon kind of comes from medieval Europe exploring Roman ruins. This idea that there was once a great civilization, and now we're all just rooting in the mud, but we get to look back at the glory of the past and these crumbling underground complexes. Fascinating stuff. One of my favorite dungeons in literature was Robert E. Howard's Red Nails. Conan the Barbarian happens upon a forgotten city, and no one in the city can leave because there are great, horrible lizards outside that will kill them if they do. So they've been there a long time. Now, the short of it, if I'm remembering everything correctly, is that a foreign army came and wanted to lay siege to the city, wanted to capture it for some reason. And one of the inhabitants of the city betrayed his countrymen and opened the gates. And in came the invading army. Now, the person that betrayed his countrymen for his service was then allowed to, got plenty of servants and tortured tons of people. It just wasn't a great guy, right? And also got heavily into weird magic stuff, like you do. So the invading army kind of fractured, splintered into two different groups. I won't get too far into this, but they were at each other's throat. And so now we have factions in this dungeon. And this is what Conan wandered into. Many years after the fact, these people have not been reproducing, they have just been dying off, and they have been locked in a battle against each other for a very long time. And they threw the wizard guy down into the catacombs at some point, and he hasn't been seen in forever. And so Conan gets to play both sides off each other. It's a kind of classic, like, outsider comes in and tips the balance. But because of the way it was set up, you had your two very banal one side fighting the other, but then there was a wizard, so it had like factions and magics and weird shit. And it's always a good idea to give your dungeon a reason to have weird shit. Like it wasn't just these two factions fighting each other. One of them also had the crawler in the dark, some monster that you never really got to see too much because, well, it crawled in the dark. And a mask that would kind of possess people and give them great power and all these other cool things that Conan had to contend with as he went through this forgotten city that was basically, well, a dungeon. So to go back to the order of rooms, I think a dungeon will always be a bit chaotic and unordered, to be honest. The current occupants are using it in a way that it wasn't really intended to be used. Those bugbears are basically holed up in the ruins that came before. That said, there are some things that we can keep in mind as far as flow. There might be a term for this, but I'm going to call it Metroiding a dungeon or Zeldaing a dungeon. Dungeons by their design are non-linear. The rooms aren't laid out in a straight order. You don't go to one, then the next, then the next. There's loops, there's doors. You might go left, you might go right. But it's not, you can't control the flow of how the players go through that, at least if you're making a decent dungeon. It's important to have choice and options. But let's say you do want to gatekeep a room. That means you need a gate and a key. Not necessarily an actual gating key, but possibly. Do you need the special boots before you can jump high enough to get to the ledge to get to the other area? Do you need a candle to burn the bush to unlock the entrance? I do this a bit in marching order on occasion, but often even then I'll try to have multiple routes to open that gate. You could potentially pick the locks, but it would be easier if you had a key. The other thing I'd like to remark on is telegraphing. I did a whole episode on this recently, but one way to add interest to a room in a dungeon is to telegraph what's in it in the rooms around it. Is there a dragon in your dungeon? What do the surrounding rooms smell like? What do you hear in them? Is the temperature hotter from all that fire breathing? Giving a room a lead up in other rooms fosters interesting choices and anticipation, both things that I'm a big fan of in a game. Another thing to keep in mind is that different types of creatures or organizations in the dungeon. How do they get along with each other? In the example above, the trolls and bugbears, well, they hate each other. In the aforementioned Conan story, we had the divided peoples and the wacky, insane wizard guy, and each of those was a faction. And most of the action of that story was derived from how these factions interacted. So, all that said, what if you're playing solo? That gets a bit tougher. Well, for one, you could just play marching order, and nothing but marching order, forever. Since it's not randomly generated, the dungeons are cohesive, but being real, that's not really a great option. I mean, I love my own game, but variety is the spice of life. When playing RPG solo, you're taking on the role of the DM and the PC. That makes it hard to get that surprise factor, and that's where the randomization aspect comes in. But the problem with random is, well, it's random. But this is something a DM has to deal with in a group game as well. Random encounters happen, and it's on the GM to make them work. And I think that's where the real challenge comes in with solo play. You're making these random things work with a context that has already developed, and that can be a challenge. But it can also be a big part of the creative fun. If you're in a dungeon full of bugbears and you roll a room that's an alchemist's laboratory, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But it can also be a new piece of history for the dungeon. Something created that lab at some time. And as the player, who's also the GM, you can make that backstory up now, or you can save it until more context clues emerge. Maybe more weird things end up being in this dungeon. Treat them as prompts and see what kind of ideas they bring up. How do they all fit together? If you're interested, on the Crumbling Keep website, we do have some good random dungeon generation tools from Philip Reed. We have On the Other Side and Classic Dungeon Encounter decks. And I think the two of those combine together really well if you do want to do a kind of randomization type dungeon. I think they have more flavor than a lot of other tools that I think can help make it more cohesive and I'm just a fan of anything Philip does, if I'm being real. But definitely worth looking into. I'll have a link for those in the show notes. I hope this helped, Kim. If worse comes to worse, you can always just not worry how the rooms are connected. Kill some monsters, avoid some traps. If folks are having fun, the dungeon is doing exactly what it needs to. Hey, you! Have thoughts on today's episode? Running into issues at your table? Have a burning question you'd like answered? Go to crumblingkeep.com/question or use the link in the show notes. I'd love to answer it on the air. Thanks for listening to the Dungeon Dorks. May all your dice rolls result in interesting situations.